The dust, kicked up by his horse's hooves, settled slowly in the scorching afternoon heat as Jacob McKenna rode into the ramshackle settlement of Bone Creek. The town wasn't much to look at, just a collection of weathered wooden buildings huddled together like frightened animals against the vast emptiness of the Arizona Territory. McKenna pulled his hat down low over his steel-gray eyes, the brim casting shadows across a face marked by years of hard living and harder choices. He'd been riding for 3 days straight, following rumors of work, of a chance to start over in a place where his past wouldn't follow. What he found instead would change everything he thought he knew about justice, courage, and the price of doing what's right. The main street of Bone Creek buzzed with an unusual energy for such a small settlement. Men clustered in groups, their voices carrying the excited edge that McKenna had learned to associate with trouble. As he guided his weary Mustang toward what passed for a saloon, he caught fragments of conversation that made his blood run cold. Someone was holding an auction, and it wasn't for cattle or mining claims. The very air seemed to thicken with an evil that McKenna recognized all too well from his days as a territorial marshal, before everything went wrong, before he'd been forced to abandon his badge and flee into the wilderness. He tied his horse to the hitching post with practiced efficiency, his weathered hands moving automatically while his mind processed the scene before him. The crowd was gathering near a makeshift platform constructed from old wooden crates and planks. On that platform stood a man McKenna instantly disliked, a greasy individual in a once fine suit now stained with sweat and dust. The man's smile was too wide, too predatory, and his eyes held the calculating gleam of someone who saw other human beings as nothing more than commodities to be bought and sold. McKenna's jaw tightened as he took in the full horror of what was about to unfold. This was wrong on every level, a violation of everything he'd once sworn to protect when he wore that star on his chest. But he was no longer a lawman. No longer had the authority to step in and stop this travesty with the power of his badge. All he had now was his conscience and the skills that had kept him alive through 2 decades of dangerous work. Sometimes, he'd learned, that had to be enough. The auctioneer, a man named Silas Blackwood, according to the murmurs in the crowd, was building up to his main attraction. McKenna pushed through the gathering of men, noting with disgust the eager anticipation on their faces. These weren't hardened criminals for the most part, just ordinary men who had allowed the isolation and lawlessness of the frontier to erode their basic humanity. It was a sight that never failed to sicken him, this casual acceptance of evil that seemed to infect settlements far from the reach of proper law and order. When Blackwood's assistant brought out the young woman, McKenna felt something twist painfully in his chest. She couldn't have been more than 19 or 20, with the proud bearing and distinctive features that marked her as belonging to one of the local tribes. Her long black hair had been roughly braided, and her simple dress was torn and dirty, but none of that could diminish the fierce dignity that radiated from her like heat from a forge. Her dark eyes swept the crowd with unconcealed contempt, and McKenna found himself thinking that she looked more like a captured warrior than a victim. The woman's name, McKenna learned from Blackwood's crude introduction, was Ayana, which meant eternal blossom in her native tongue. The irony wasn't lost on him that such a beautiful name should be spoken by such a vile man. Blackwood spun a tale about how she'd been rescued from a raid, how she needed a good Christian home to civilize her savage ways. McKenna had heard such lies before, had seen how they were used to justify the unjustifiable. The truth was written in the defiance in Ayana's eyes and the way she held herself despite her circumstances. The bidding started low, with men calling out amounts like they were purchasing livestock. McKenna's hands clenched into fists as he watched the disgusting spectacle unfold. $3 seemed to be the highest bid, coming from a rancher named Kowalski, who had a reputation for cruelty that extended to both animals and the people who worked for him. McKenna had heard stories about Kowalski's ranch, whispered tales of workers who went there and were never seen again. The thought of this proud young woman ending up in such a place was more than he could bear. Without fully conscious thought, McKenna found himself stepping forward. His voice cut through the crowd like a blade, clear and commanding with all the authority he'd once wielded as a lawman. $10, he called out, his words causing a ripple of surprise to run through the gathering. It was an enormous sum for such a transaction, more money than many of these men saw in a month of hard work. The crowd turned to stare at him, this tall stranger with the cold eyes and the air of barely controlled violence. Blackwood's greedy eyes lit up at the prospect of such an unexpected windfall. He tried to restart the bidding, hoping to drive the price even higher, but McKenna's reputation had preceded him even to this remote corner of the territory. Men whispered his name, spoke of the shootings in Tombstone, of the corrupt sheriff who'd tried to have him killed, of the 3 men McKenna had faced down in the street when he'd refused to look the other way at their crimes. The smart ones in the crowd began to back away, sensing that they were in the presence of a man who was far more dangerous than his quiet demeanor suggested. When no other bids materialized, Blackwood grudgingly accepted McKenna's offer. The exchange of money for human freedom left a bitter taste in McKenna's mouth, but he consoled himself with the knowledge that he was removing Ayanna from immediate danger. As the crowd began to disperse, disappointed by the anticlimactic end to their entertainment, McKenna approached the platform where Ayanna stood waiting. Up close, he could see the intelligence burning in her dark eyes, the way she assessed him with the wariness of a wild animal evaluating a potential threat. Their first exchange was brief, but loaded with meaning. "I am not your property," she said in accented but clear English, her voice carrying all the pride of her people. McKenna nodded slowly, understanding that this was a test of his intentions. "No," he agreed quietly. "You're not. You're free to go wherever you choose." The surprise that flickered across her features told him that this was not what she had expected to hear from the man who had just purchased her. What happened next surprised them both. Instead of walking away, Ayanna studied his face with those penetrating dark eyes and seemed to reach some internal decision. "You have kind eyes," she said finally, "but they are also sad. You carry heavy burdens." It was an observation that cut closer to the truth than McKenna was comfortable with, delivered with the directness he was beginning to realize was characteristic of this remarkable young woman. As they left Bone Creek together, McKenna on his horse and Ayanna walking beside him with the fluid grace of someone raised in harmony with the natural world, he learned more about her story. She had not been rescued from a raid, as Blackwood had claimed. Instead, she had been taken while gathering medicinal plants near her village, kidnapped by men who saw her beauty and thought they could profit from it. Her people were peaceful, she explained, traders and farmers who sought only to live in harmony with the land that had sustained them for countless generations. The revelation of her true circumstances only deepened McKenna's disgust with what he had witnessed in Bone Creek. He had seen enough injustice in his years as a lawman to know that such crimes were all too common on the frontier, where the absence of proper authority allowed evil men to prey upon the innocent with impunity. But there was something about Ayanna's quiet strength and dignity that made her suffering seem particularly cruel, a senseless waste of something beautiful and pure. As they traveled through the rugged landscape of the Arizona Territory, McKenna found himself drawn into conversations that revealed the depth of Ayanna's knowledge and wisdom. She spoke of her people's history, of ancient traditions and stories passed down through generations. She knew the properties of every plant they encountered, could read the subtle signs in the sky that predicted changes in weather, and moved through the harsh desert environment with an ease that made McKenna's own considerable outdoor skills seem clumsy by comparison. It was on their third day of travel together that Ayanna revealed the secret that would change everything. They had made camp in a sheltered canyon, and McKenna was tending to their small fire when she approached him with an expression of serious determination. In her hands, she carried a leather pouch that she had kept hidden during their journey, never letting it out of her sight, even when they stopped to rest. With careful, reverent movements, she opened the pouch and revealed its contents to the flickering firelight. The object that emerged from the worn leather was unlike anything McKenna had ever seen. It appeared to be a map of sorts, drawn on what looked like specially treated hide and marked with symbols and lines that seemed to pulse with their own inner life in the dancing shadows cast by the fire. The craftsmanship was exquisite, clearly the work of someone with both artistic skill and deep spiritual knowledge. But it was the implications of what the map represented that made McKenna's breath catch in his throat. Ayana's voice was barely above a whisper as she explained the true significance of what she carried. This was not just any map, she told him, but a sacred document that had been guarded by her family for more generations than anyone could count. It showed the location of a place that existed in the borderland between legend and reality, a hidden valley where her ancestors had once lived in perfect harmony with the natural world. More importantly for their current circumstances, it was also the site of a Spanish treasure that had been lost for over 2 centuries. The story she told was one of conquest and resistance, of Spanish conquistadors who had forced her people to mine gold from secret veins hidden deep in the mountains. When disease and oppression had finally driven the survivors to flee, they had collapsed the mine entrances and hidden all traces of their former prosperity. The map was their insurance policy, a way to reclaim their heritage if they were ever in desperate enough circumstances to risk returning to a place that held both great wealth and terrible memories. McKenna listened to her tale with growing amazement, understanding now why she had been targeted for kidnapping. If word of this map had somehow reached the wrong ears, it would explain the specific interest in capturing her alive, rather than simply raiding her village for whatever they could carry away. Men like Blackwood made their living by exploiting others, and a treasure map would represent the ultimate prize for someone of his mercenary nature. The implications of Ayana's revelation were staggering. The Spanish had been notorious for their exploitation of native labor in their quest for gold, and the amounts they had extracted from the New World were legendary. If even a fraction of those stories were true, the treasure hidden in Ayana's ancestral valley could be worth more than most men would see in 100 lifetimes. But McKenna also understood that such wealth came with a price that was measured in more than just money. As Ayana carefully returned the map to its protective pouch, she looked at McKenna with eyes that seemed to see straight through to his soul. "I am telling you this," she said with quiet intensity, "because you saved me when you had no reason to do so. Because you could have claimed me as your property, but instead gave me my freedom. My grandmother always taught me to recognize the signs of a good heart, and I believe I see those signs in you." McKenna felt the weight of her trust settling on his shoulders like a physical burden. Here was a secret that could change both their lives, but also one that would put them both in terrible danger if the wrong people learned of its existence. He thought of Blackwood and men like him, predators who would stop at nothing to get their hands on such a prize. He thought of corrupt officials and greedy businessmen who would see Ayana as nothing more than a means to an end, a disposable tool to be used and discarded once they had what they wanted. The choice before him was clear, even if the path forward was fraught with peril. He could try to convince Ayana to hide the map away and forget about its existence, to seek safety in anonymity and distance from those who would exploit her heritage. Or he could help her reclaim what was rightfully hers, even knowing that such a course would put them both at odds with powerful forces that would see them dead rather than lose access to such wealth. McKenna made his decision with the same instinctive certainty that had guided him through 2 decades of dangerous work as a lawman. "Then we'll find this valley," he said simply, his words carrying all the conviction of a sacred oath. "We'll find it, and we'll make sure that whatever treasure is there goes to help your people rather than lining the pockets of men like Blackwood." The smile that spread across Ayana's features was like sunrise after a long night, transforming her already beautiful face into something luminous with hope and determination. In that moment, McKenna understood that he was no longer just a broken-down former lawman running from his past. He was a man with a purpose again, someone who could make a difference in the fight between good and evil that seemed to define life on the frontier. Their journey to find the hidden valley would prove to be far more dangerous and complicated than either of them could have imagined. Word of McKenna's interference in Bone Creek had spread quickly, and it wasn't long before they found themselves being tracked by men who were determined to reclaim what they saw as stolen property. Blackwood had not given up on his prize, and he had enlisted the help of some very dangerous individuals to help him get it back. The first attempt to recapture Ayana came just 5 days after they had left Bone Creek behind. McKenna's instincts, honed by years of staying alive in dangerous situations, warned him that they were being followed long before their pursuers made their move. He and Ayana took cover in a maze of red sandstone formations, using the natural landscape to their advantage in a deadly game of cat and mouse that lasted through the night and into the following day. McKenna's skills with a rifle proved to be the deciding factor in their escape, but not before he had been forced to kill 2 of Blackwood's hired guns in a fierce firefight that echoed through the canyon walls like thunder. The violence sickened him, as it always had, but he took grim satisfaction in knowing that he had protected someone who deserved protection. Ayana tended to his wounds with hands that were gentle but sure, using traditional healing techniques that proved remarkably effective. As they continued their journey toward the hidden valley, McKenna began to understand just how remarkable his companion truly was. Ayana possessed a kind of wisdom that went far beyond her years, a deep understanding of both the natural world and human nature that made her insights invaluable. She could track game through terrain that seemed impossibly difficult, could find water in places where McKenna would have sworn none existed, and could read the intentions of strangers with an accuracy that seemed almost supernatural. More than that, she possessed a moral strength that reminded McKenna of why he had become a lawman in the first place. Despite everything she had endured, despite the cruelty and injustice she had witnessed, Ayana maintained a fundamental belief in the goodness of people that was both inspiring and humbling. She spoke of forgiveness not as weakness, but as the ultimate expression of strength, of the need to break cycles of violence and hatred that had trapped her people and their oppressors alike. The hidden valley, when they finally found it after weeks of careful searching, proved to be everything that Ayana's stories had promised and more. Nestled between towering cliffs that protected it from discovery, it was a place of incredible natural beauty, where clear streams fed lush meadows and ancient trees provided shelter from the desert sun. The ruins of the old village were still visible, covered by centuries of growth, but retaining the basic outline of a civilization that had valued harmony with the natural world above all else. The treasure itself was more modest than the wild legends would have suggested, but still substantial enough to provide security for Ayana's displaced people. Hidden in carefully concealed caves were stores of worked gold and silver, created by master craftsmen whose skill had been passed down through generations. More valuable still were the sacred objects and historical artifacts that told the story of a proud people who had refused to be completely conquered by their oppressors. As they catalogued their discovery, McKenna found himself thinking about the future in ways he hadn't done since his world had been turned upside down by corruption and betrayal. Here was a chance to build something lasting and good, to use wealth not for personal gain, but to help those who had been forgotten by a society that valued progress over justice. Ayana spoke of establishing schools and hospitals, of purchasing land where her people could live safely without fear of displacement or persecution. The final confrontation with Blackwood and his remaining allies came just as they were preparing to transport the treasure to safety. The greedy auctioneer had been more persistent than McKenna had anticipated, following their trail with the help of native trackers who had been bribed or coerced into betraying their own people. The battle that followed was brief but vicious, fought among the ancient ruins with a ferocity that seemed to awaken echoes of older conflicts. When the gunsmoke finally cleared, Blackwood lay dead among the stones of the ruined village, his dreams of easy wealth ended by McKenna's steady aim and uncompromising sense of justice. His surviving men scattered to the winds, carrying with them stories that would ensure McKenna's reputation as a man not to be crossed. But for McKenna himself, the victory felt hollow, another addition to a tally of violence that he wished could have been avoided. Ayana's response to the carnage was characteristically wise and compassionate. Rather than celebrating the defeat of their enemies, she spoke of the tragedy of lives wasted in pursuit of something that could never bring true happiness. She performed traditional ceremonies for the dead, honoring even their fallen enemies as human beings who had lost their way, rather than dismissing them as monsters beyond redemption. The establishment of the new settlement that grew from their discovery of the treasure became a model for how different peoples could live together in harmony and mutual respect. McKenna found himself serving as an unofficial sheriff for the growing community, using his skills to protect rather than destroy, to build rather than tear down. The badge he wore now was carved from wood by one of Ayana's cousins, but it carried more meaning for him than the official star he had once worn with such pride. Ayana became the heart of the new community, using her knowledge of traditional healing and her natural wisdom to guide the settlement through the challenges of growth and development. She established schools where both native traditions and modern skills were taught side by side, creating a generation of young people who were equipped to thrive in a changing world without losing touch with their heritage. The love that grew between McKenna and Ayana was as natural and inevitable as the changing of the seasons, built on a foundation of mutual respect and shared values that transcended the superficial differences of race and culture. Their wedding was celebrated according to both Christian and native traditions, symbolizing the kind of unity and understanding that their community represented. It was a love story that proved that true connection between people was based on character and compatibility, rather than the accidents of birth and circumstance. Years later, as McKenna sat on the porch of their home, watching their children play in the garden that Ayana had coaxed from the desert soil, he often reflected on the strange chain of events that had brought them together. A routine stop in a forgotten settlement, a moment of moral courage that had seemed insignificant at the time, had led to discoveries and experiences that had transformed not just his own life, but the lives of countless others. The $3 he had paid to secure Ayana's freedom had proven to be the best investment he had ever made, not because of the treasure it had ultimately led them to, but because of the treasure of human connection and purpose that it had revealed. In saving her, he had in many ways saved himself, finding redemption from his past failures and a future worth living for. The settlement continued to grow and prosper, becoming known throughout the territory as a place where justice prevailed, and all people were treated with dignity and respect. Travelers would often comment on the unusual harmony that existed there, the way that people of different backgrounds worked together toward common goals. What they were witnessing, though few of them understood it at the time, was proof that the ideals upon which America had been founded could actually work when people had the courage to live up to them. McKenna's story became legend in its own right, told around campfires and in saloons across the frontier. But he never sought fame or recognition for what he had done, content to live quietly with the woman he loved and the community they had built together. He had learned that true heroism was not about dramatic gestures or moments of glory, but about the daily choice to do what was right even when it was difficult or dangerous. The map that had started their adventure was eventually donated to the tribal council, where it was treated with the reverence it deserved as a sacred document connecting the present with the ancestral past. But its real value had never been in the treasure it had revealed, but in the way it had brought together two people who had needed each other more than either of them had realized at the time. If you enjoyed this tale of courage, redemption, and the power of doing what's right, please give this video a thumbs up and subscribe to our channel for more stories from the Old West. Leave a comment below and tell us about a time when you had to make a difficult moral choice, or share what you think you would have done in McKenna's situation. What does true heroism mean to you in today's world, and how can we apply the lessons of the frontier to our modern challenges? Your thoughts and experiences help build our community of storytelling, so don't be shy about sharing your perspective with fellow listeners who appreciate tales of justice and human dignity.